The first smart positioning that the National Guard did was put someone right here. This person had a machine gun and was ready to lay down fire if Jerry Miles or Lee Smart decided to leave the cell tower and got close to the hostages. He was super important in terms of keeping Jerry Miles and Lee Smart far away from the hostages because if Jerry Miles felt threatened, he promised to light all the hostages on fire. I'm not quite sure the best way to put this, but in 1957, there was the great Pea Riot of Montana State Prison. This was a riot that had to do with pee, but don't worry, it wasn't a bodily function or human liquid, piss. It was little peas that people would pick in the Montana State Garden, and with it being July, super hot, some prisoners weren't very keen on doing this. And a couple of them actually brought up such a stink about picking these peas that they were sent to the hole, which, if you've seen any prison movie, or you can look at the B-roll that I got actually going to Montana State Prison, the hole isn't exactly where you want to be. Dark room, all by yourself. Super, super scary form of prison punishment. However, some prisoners actually did stay outside and pick their peas. And this 24-hour standoff between the National Guard and the prisoners of Montana State Prison started with one prisoner just flicking peas at another. This caused such a commotion that the prisoners started getting rowdy, and even prisoners still in their cell blocks got wind of the violence and the chaos, and eventually they were able to get the upper hand of the guards. That's how rowdy this was, and put all of the guards on duty into a cell. Important keynote, the warden of the prison at the time, Faye Burnell, was not on site. He was doing a prisoner transfer all the way in Indiana, which meant that no one was technically in charge, and the National Guard, like I mentioned earlier, had to step in. From what I could tell, all the prisoners wanted was some better food, better accommodations, and the firing of a certain new parole officer, Benjamin W. Wright, who they didn't think very highly of. And the current Attorney General, Forrest Anderson, was actually like, hey, I hear your complaints. Here are these 8 points. If you agree to them, go to your cell. We'll make all these 8 changes for you. And the prisoners loved the idea. So they went back to their cells, happy and content with the 8 points that Forrest Anderson and the National Guard brought up, and the conflict was settled. Kind of a happy ending to the 1997 Pea Riot. Just kidding. Then the warden came back and was like, you know what? I actually don't want to do any of that. So luckily, all the prisoners went back to their cells, but then the warden came back and throughout the entire negotiation that they made, you could say that the inmates were quite peeved about this, and that's probably why there was 2 other riots in the years following. So yeah, not ideal. Devil's advocate, on the Wikipedia page, it said the warden said, I don't negotiate with convicts. Kind of goes hard. It's your prison, someone else makes a deal. You're like, wait, I'm in charge. I make the deals. So it makes sense that he would not like that they made the decision to go along with what the convicts wanted. But at the same time, if you wanted to piss or peeve a lot of people off, yeah, making a deal with them and then pulling it away, great way to do that. I sure hope no one dies because of another riot later. Subsequent riot came the next year, but this was more of a strike or sit down where prisoners refused to work, take orders, and basically just loitered around the prison and their cells, being very uncooperative with the warden and his guards. The biggest hit to the prison was the fact that this was during the Council of Corrections visit to the prison, so it made them look really bad. But Warren Burnell had a pretty effective way to get all the prisoners back in line. He cut off the heat and removed all food options from the prisoners, meaning they all got really cold and really hungry, considering that this happened during wintertime. And they all went back to their normal lives as Montana State prisoners. As a punishment for their disregard of the warden's authority, the prisoners were cut off from the canteen, which meant they couldn't buy cigarettes or soda, things like that. Which for me would have been devastating, not because of the cigarettes, but because I'm a dude that likes Diet Coke. Get me a Diet Coke, I'm a happy camper. Take it away from me, I'm going to start the next riot. Luckily, it was only a week and the prisoners went back to normal. Not that big of a riot, but still a consequence of the Pea Riot and the false promises made by the Attorney General that obviously fell short once the warden got back and decided to throw all of it out. Unfortunately, the next riot wasn't quite so peaceful. Before we get any further, I wanted to remind you guys that this is part 2 of a 3-part series on the Montana State Prison. Part 1 was all on Frank Conley and an escape attempt that nearly took his life. Part 2, this one, it's about a riot. You guys know that. And then part 3 is going to be about the paranormal things that have happened. And I'm going to really focus on my tour and trip through the Montana State Prison that I did about 2 weeks ago with a group of friends. If that sounds interesting, make sure to subscribe. And let's get back to the video. So I think the smartest thing to do would be to set the scene and talk about the key characters or people involved in this. This involves some of the guards and the warden staff, as well as a couple key inmates that, of course, caused the riot. So let's break it down piece by piece and get an understanding of what was going on at the time. I'm burning alive. I'm going to take this shirt off. I'm sorry for the continuity of the video. But Warden Faye O'Burnell was the warden during the last 2 riots, and he was replaced by Floyd Powell in 1958. This separates the last 2 riots and this last catastrophic, more bloody and violent one. This doesn't mean that Powell was a worse warden. In fact, he was actually trying to bring change to the prison system and modernize it, making it safer for guards and more reforming for the prisoners. He was really trying to make a positive change for the prison. Although, while ambitious, some people saw his change as an arrogant attempt for control. This task was so large that he decided to reach back into his roots and go all the way to Wisconsin, where he recruited Deputy Warden Ted Ruthie. Which, speaking of Wisconsin, I didn't plan this, but I just took that shirt off because I was hot. This is a Moose Jaw shirt, which Moose Jaw is a restaurant in Wisconsin and is really cool. It's really good. Recommend going there if you're in Wisconsin. But enough about that. This is Montana After Midnight. While Ted Ruthie's professionalism and assistance was definitely required at the time, knowing what we know now, I kind of have to wonder if Powell ever regrets recruiting Ruthie, but you'll understand more what I'm saying later. The 2 men brought reform to the prison, cracking down on a con boss system, which I had no idea what it was at the time, but it would seem that this is a system where certain inmates would actually be allowed to be promoted to boss in a certain work detail. So if there is a group of inmates that are working in a fabric department making garments for people, that there could be a certain inmate that is the assistant manager of that department, which is just kind of crazy and led to a lot of power imbalances because these inmates would just naturally have more influence over what was going on a day-to-day basis. So, recognizing this power imbalance, Powell decided to get rid of that con boss system. Another goal of Warden Powell's was to crack down on the black market that was occurring within the Montana State Prison. This affected prisoners as well as the guards who would assist and make the black market even possible. Basically, there was just a more systematic approach to the guards' watch schedule that cut down on the ability for certain guards to even help out the prisoners or the prisoners to be able to do something behind the scenes. Overall, the prison was much more watchful and thorough, cutting down on the black market that was going on previously. While Powell was successful in changing those aspects of the prison, he was not successful in his next idea, which was to remove the rifles from the cell blocks. The rifles would be stored in a certain area in the cell block far away from the prisoners, but there just in case the guards need them. Powell reasoned that these rifles were only a temptation to the prisoners, just egging them on to reach for them and try to escape. Powell was unsuccessful in getting these rifles removed as guards felt much more secure, keeping them in close proximity and always having them at the ready in case they need them. While I understand where they're coming from, later in the story you're going to understand why Powell may have been right about getting rid of the rifles on the cell block floor. Like when trying to implement any change, it was really hard to convince the guards and the prisoners alike, who largely benefited from a lax system, that any of these tight neck changes were actually for the better. And it was these changes and failed changes that actually led to the tensions and set the tone for the 1959 riot. I also think it's important to talk about some of these other side things that were going on that set the stage even better for the riot and the time period. Apparently, the conditions were really miserable for the guards and the prisoners alike. The prison was outdated. If you watch my previous video on Frank Conley, he really focused on updating the prison and making it the standard for everyone else to follow. But since then, it has really gone downhill, and it was no longer an innovative and impressive prison. It was now a deteriorating and trashy prison. They didn't even have modern plumbing, and that'll come into play later in an interesting way. It's also important to say that riots were breaking out in the United States all over during the 1950s, and it wasn't just in Montana. It was actually a phenomenon seen across America. Now, focusing back in on the Montana State Prison, Powell himself said that he felt very unconfident in the state of the prison, saying that his guards weren't up to snuff, and pretty much no one liked the reforms that he was trying to put in, too stuck to their old ways. And a newspaper near Deer Lodge at the time said that the conditions were looking like a smoking volcano ready to erupt, which, as we know now, eventually it did. Now let's shift gears and talk about some of the inmates that absolutely hated all the reform that Floyd Powell and Ted Ruth were trying to bring to the prison. There are 3 men known for the riot of 1959, with their boss and main influence being Jerry Myles. Jerry Myles was a career criminal, spending 25 of his 45 years behind bars. He spent so much of his life in prison that it seemed like it was his preferred state of being. He'd rather be locked up in a prison where he could be the con boss and running gangs than be outside and basically be a nobody. Part of his 25 years in prison was spent in Alcatraz, the scariest and most famous prison in all of America. And during his time in Alcatraz, he witnessed the battle for Alcatraz, which unfortunately I actually don't really know much about, but apparently the riot that occurred at Montana State Prison shared a lot of similarities with the Battle of Alcatraz. If you listen to the rest of this story and you know about the Battle of Alcatraz, you can let me know how similar they actually are. I'm not kidding when I say one of the craziest aspects of this story was finding out that Jerry Myles purposely bought a ticket to Butte, Montana for the sole reason of getting arrested. Yes, he wanted to get arrested in Montana so he would be sent directly to Montana State Prison, where he heard that inmates basically ran the show. His goal was to get arrested and become the biggest con boss in Montana State Prison. Bro wasn't even trying to be like a crazy serial killer, kill like 20 people, and then accidentally gets arrested. No, he was beelining it for Montana to specifically get arrested and be thrown right in prison. The thing he got arrested for in Butte was just robbing somebody, and that got him time in prison of like 5 years, where they didn't run a background check or anything like that. Just threw him in general population and let him run wild. Since Myles was so used to the prison system, being locked up in Georgia and Alcatraz and all these other prisons, he actually was able to get to con boss status super quickly and did get the power that he was so eagerly chasing. And he got the nickname, and I'm not joking, Little Hitler. His nickname was Little Hitler because of how terrible and scary he was with the power that he got from being a con boss of the garment section of the prison. So I'm guessing just like working with fabric. Yeah, you know that guy Little Hitler? He's a madman on a sewing machine. With the power that he accrued from becoming a con boss within the prison labor system, Myles was able to use his power over younger inmates, requiring sexual favors for certain benefits within his labor section, which is kind of crazy and something I would never imagine. But when you think of prison stereotypes, I guess it kind of makes sense. And apparently Jerry Myles was like a psychopath. He was reportedly extremely smart, having an IQ of like 140, and would actually make a perfectly fine scholar if he just wasn't addicted to being some kind of weird, manipulative, prison focused, creepy guy. With that being said, I think it's time we talk about Jerry Miles's boyfriend, Lee Smart. I say that with a little bit of an asterisk. Some sources say that they were prison boyfriends. Other sources say they were just accomplices and like-minded individuals. Whatever you want to believe, they worked together to cause the bloodiest riot in Montana State Prison history, at least at this facility, but that's another story. Lee Smart was a 19-year-old psychopath that came from the state of Washington. Lee Smart was arrested for bludgeoning to death a salesman with a pair of pliers. And I don't know what it is about researching these stories, specifically with the last Montana State Prison video where someone was beaten to death with a horse bridle and now a pair of pliers. It always baffles my mind how creative some people get with how to kill somebody else. And it's this aspect of Smart's lore where he is willing to commit murder in such a unique and disturbing way that adds to his mystique and what also gave him so much clout in the Montana State Prison at the time. You see, most prisoners were there on petty robbery charges, and the fact that he was a 19-year-old murderer actually scared a lot of the other prisoners and gave him some clout. However, this wasn't enough, with him being about 140 pounds, standing at 6 feet tall, which, if you want like an estimate, I'm looking pretty skinny. Pretty fairly skinny, dude. Maybe average, probably average. I'm 6 foot and I'm 160. He's 6 foot and 140. So not really got a lot going on. Anyway, long story short, he ended up having to buy some protection, and that's where our third crew member came into play, George Alton. Alton was super well known amongst the prisoners and guards, but not as nefariously as the other two inmates I talked about. Instead, he was just well liked and well known, and someone that you could hire to protect you from other inmates. Unfortunately for Lee Smart, Alton was eventually so well liked that he was moved to the minimum security section of the prison, far away from Lee Smart and Jerry Myles. I was able to find this kind of funny story with George Alton, but I'm finding it on Wikipedia, so take it with a grain of salt. Apparently, he got so comfortable in his minimum security prison that he decided he was going to break out with a couple other inmates, and this occurred on Warden Powell's second day as the warden. So he broke out of prison, stole a car, and then as he was driving in Deer Lodge, waved to Warden Powell, who then waved back at him as he was on his way to work to start his second day at the prison. Warren Powell eventually realized what had happened, but by then it was too late, and George Alton already got way far away from the prison. He eventually was captured in his hometown, being sent back to the prison and being put in the hole for his breakout attempt. After his time in the hole, George Alton would be sent to segregation, where it just so happens that he would be placed right next to Jerry Myles. And these two inmates got to talking, and talking turned to plotting, and plotting turned into the 1959 Montana State Riot. Quickly, before we dive into the actual riot, let's talk about why Myles himself was in segregation. He was taken out of the general population after butting heads with Ted Ruthie, the deputy warden talked about previously, anointed by Warden Powell. The conflict starts with Warden Powell and Ted Ruthie wanting to reform the prison, and Jerry Myles wanting the exact opposite. If you remember, Myles is only there because he wanted to run the prison as a con boss. And in 1958, as soon as Powell got power, all of a sudden there were no con bosses. And Warden Powell and Ted Ruthie decided to run background checks and knew that Jerry Myles was much worse than he seemed to be. Myles was taken off of his current labor crew and put into the water labor crew, which was charged with like cleaning out toilets from guard and prison stations. So a much worse position for Myles, and Myles started acting up because his stint at the Montana State Prison was taking a turn for the worse. Because of the way he was acting up, he had a conflict with Ted Ruthie, who sent him to isolation for a little bit, and then segregation. The sociologists on site at the prison actually recommended that Jerry Myles never re-enter the general population, but Ted Ruthie decided that he thinks that Jerry Myles deserved a second chance. With all the new reforms going on, he wanted to treat every prisoner fairly. So Jerry Myles and George Alton eventually did make it back into the general population, allowing the riots to take place. Of course, looking back, I think Ted Ruthie would absolutely not let this happen. But hindsight is 2020, and there's no way that he could have known what was about to happen. At 3:30 p.m. on April 16th, 1959, guard Gus Byers was walking around on an upper catwalk in the Montana State Prison. He decided that he was going to open up a window and let some fresh air in the musty prison when he heard someone yell his name from behind him. Startled, he started to turn around and face whoever was calling his name when he was met with a face full of gasoline. Shocked, confused, and blind, he could only make out one thing for certain, and that's that the person in front of him had just lit something on fire. You see, Jerry Myles had been doing some planning, and he was actually able to track the guards' movements throughout the day, discovering a gap in their rotation right before dinner time. From there, he started working with George Alton and Lee Smart, devising a plan to start their escape attempt/riot. George Alton was a key member of this escape attempt because he was the one that worked in the Montana State Prison's garage and had access to the gasoline. It was him who slowly smuggled gasoline where they would store it in Lee Smart's cell for these 3 convicts to try to break out of the prison. While he was a key component in storing the gasoline and getting this ball rolling, he actually wasn't super happy to be working with Lee Smart or Jerry Myles, but he was just so entranced with the possibility of escape that he was willing to work with them. As you might be able to guess, it was Jerry Myles screaming the guard's name, getting him to turn around, only for Lee Smart to come in and douse the guard in gasoline. Jerry Myles at the same time was lighting up a broom or mop, which he could use as leverage to intimidate the guard, getting him to give up keys and his rifle. Also, it should be said that objects were thrown on the catwalk, blocking the guard in so he couldn't run away. Again, basically blind, literal gasoline in his eyes, covered head to toe. If any of the fire touched him, he would have ignited immediately. That's what makes this escape attempt so cunning and also psychopathic. After Gus Byers gave the cons what they wanted, he was escorted to the hole where he would stay for the remainder of the riot. The other guards, suspecting nothing, would come into the cell block one by one, assuming their normal duties, only to be captured and then brought to the hole right alongside Gus Byers. From there, the men needed to get to Deputy Warden Tim Ruthie, where the plan was to take him hostage and use him as a meat shield to gain access to the main gate, which would then give them access to the outside world, which would mean freedom and a successful escape attempt. Lee Smart and Jerry Myles would have to make their way to Ted Ruthie's office, which was being guarded by 2 other guards and a locked door. Luckily, the men were able to get into the building and then wait for the guards to be switching positions. With the door halfway open, they busted through it, and at this point, they were actually concealing the rifles that they got earlier. Anyway, they busted through it. Jerry Myles was holding a meat cleaver that he got from the kitchen of the prison, and then they forced the 2 guards waiting outside of Ted Ruthie's office into the bathroom. After forcing the guards into the bathroom, Lee Smart and Jerry Myles busted into Ted Ruthie's office, where, caught off guard, he stood up as Jerry Myles almost immediately started lunging at him, trying to attack and kill him. While Ted Ruthie did put up quite a good struggle, he only lasted a few seconds before Lee Smart pulled out his rifle that he recently had gotten from one of the guards and shot Ted Ruthie down, killing him almost immediately. Not even 30 minutes into the Montana State Riot of 1959, the first victim, Ted Ruthie, was murdered. After the murder of Ted Ruthie, the other inmates in the 1912 cell block joined in on the chaos, and it wasn't just contained to the Lee Smart, George Alton, and Jerry Myles breakout crew. Now, the other inmates had homemade knives and meat cleavers that they had gotten from the kitchen, and they were causing all sorts of chaos. And I believe that this is a point of divide within our group of 3 inmates, and the reason why Jerry Myles and Lee Smart are looked at as so much worse than George Alton, who I believe had no repercussions from this riot. And that's because George Alton only wanted to escape the prison. But at this point, it was abundantly clear that Lee Smart and Jerry Myles were doing something much more sadistic. They simply wanted to cause chaos and make a name for themselves for starting a huge massacre of a riot. They could not care less about breaking out, and that ties deeply with Jerry Myles getting himself arrested in Montana and just wanting to be the largest con boss, where George Alton only sought freedom and just didn't want to be locked up anymore. So from there, Jerry Myles and Lee Smart climbed one of these cell towers, and they took 3 hostages with them when George Alton decided to split off, no longer associating with them. Howdy, welcome to the best part of the video. It's the whiteboard section. Like I mentioned, after the murder of Ted Ruthie, the 2 men decided to retreat to a cell tower. That tower is right here. I'm going to put a big JM and LS. There were also over 20 hostages involved in the riots, and they were held in the 3rd level of the normal cell block house. So I'm going to put a big H right here. Now, like I mentioned, there were other prisoners involved in this riot, and the whole cell house was free, carrying around knives, causing a little bit of chaos. But they weren't as involved or invested as Lee Smart or Jerry Myles. So while they're around, they're not really causing quite as big of an issue as these 2 are. So after about 36 hours of the riot, the National Guard decided to make their move. They did a couple of smart things to really pin down Jerry Myles and Lee Smart, who again were stuck in a cell tower. And there's actually this kind of cool image of those 2 men sitting, looking outside of a window in their cell tower, which is also kind of crazy because you would think that they might get sniped or at least would be worried about getting shot, but no, the picture exists. I guess they were just having tea by the window. The first smart positioning that the National Guard did was put someone right here. This person had a machine gun and was ready to lay down fire if Jerry Myles or Lee Smart decided to leave the cell tower and got close to the hostages. He was super important in terms of keeping Jerry Myles and Lee Smart far away from the hostages, because if Jerry Myles felt threatened, he promised to light all the hostages on fire. Just like how he almost lit Gus Byers earlier, Jerry Myles was not only going to kill people that got in his way, he was going to kill them in the most horrific way possible. While that's a super smart placement, this was a really cool placement. They put a bazooka from World War II on one of the prison walls that shot 2 bazookas at the cell tower. Now, from the documentary that I watched, the first bazooka shot didn't end up even hitting the cell tower. In fact, I don't know what the hell happened to that bazooka shot. We can pretend that like it just went up in space or something. I don't know. Like, he shot a bazooka and then nothing happened. It did not hit the tower. It's still going, guys. No, but apparently the first shot was a miss, and it did not hit the cell tower. I'm guessing it just hit some not important part of the prison or past the prison. And then the second bazooka shot actually did hit the cell tower and caused a little bit of damage. When I was actually doing my tour through the Montana State Prison, I saw the damage, and this was before I saw other pictures of it, and I was like, I think that's where the bazooka hit. And happy to say I was right. The picture that I got was of the bazooka shot on the cell tower. So with a bazooka positioned on the wall, aimed at the cell towers, shooting down at it, and a man positioned in between the hostages and the ringleaders of the riots, the National Guard decided to make its move into the cell block, throwing tear gas and subduing all the rioters within the prison. Luckily for them, like I mentioned earlier, the prisoners' hearts weren't really in it. While Jerry Miles and Lee Smart were determined to escape and riot and go down with the prison in the end, everyone else seemed content to just go back to their cells and listen to the National Guard as they busted in. With all the other prisoners giving up, going back to their cells, and the hostages being saved by the National Guard, Jerry Miles and Lee Smart were cornered in their cell tower. With no one to negotiate with and no more hostages to threaten, Lee Smart shot Jerry Miles and then took his own life. Apparently, it was a complete bloodbath up in that cell tower, and I found this disturbing news clip that I'll play for you right now.
Their intent was that it would be a bloody mess when the guardsmen got there, and sure enough, the second man up the stairs slipped and fell. Didn't know what had caused it, but he reached down and felt something and put it in his pocket. About 4 years ago, he brings me back a package and said, "I've had this all these years and used it, and I think it should belong back here to the prison." And he dumped out of a bag into my hand the jawbone of Jerry Miles.
Now, while I had that news clip and a documentary that was super helpful in doing research for this riot, one of the coolest things that I found was historic footage of the guards and some of the hostages talking after this riot. It's all in black and white and it's like a minute long. I'm going to link it in the description, but it has this annoying historical archives watermark on it, which is just kind of stupid. So I'm not putting it in the video, but you guys should watch it. It's in the description. It's historical footage, historical news footage. It's awesome. And with that, Jerry Miles and Lee Smart were both dead, and the 1959 Montana State Prison riot came to a close. And this was the last riot within the confines of the old Montana State Prison. But by its name, I'm guessing you could figure out that there is a new Montana State Prison, and eventually there was a riot there as well. And that is the story of Jerry's Riot, or the 1959 riots. Now, I could not have done this without documentaries, news videos, a little bit of Wikipedia. I had to use that more than I would like to on this video, but luckily that cited back to a book written about Jerry's Riot, which was also extremely useful. So I'm going to link all of that in the description per usual. And I wanted to highlight something that I thought was really cool, and it's that the fact that the new Montana State Prison also offers convict labor, but in a little bit of a different way. While Frank Connolly, which I made a video about, this is a part 2, this video right now that you're in, this is part 2. Part 1 was about Frank Connolly, and he was in love with convict labor and building highways, buildings, walls, stuff like that through prisoner labor, right? As you would imagine. But the new Montana State Prison actually allows convict cowboys. I don't know if that's what they call them. They're basically just convicts in minimal security prison status that will do ranch hand type stuff. There's like a full dairy farm, and then also literal like cattle ranching convicts. That's awesome. I might get arrested and go there. I'm actually not going to do that, but I thought that was super cool. I'll probably make a YouTube short about it. But yeah, just a little fun fact for you. I want to say thank you guys so much for watching the videos. I'm just under 1,000 subscribers, and by the time this is out, I already know I'm going to be at 1,000 subscribers, which is awesome. I've spent a lot of time on these videos, and this Montana State Prison series is a really big effort that I'm doing, and there's still a whole part 3 to come out, so make sure that you guys subscribe so you see that. And if you're wondering how you could support me more, in the description there's a playlist of videos that you guys can just watch so you can get caught up on all my videos. And if you really want to support me, maybe send out some of my favorite videos to your friends or on your social media. That would be a huge blessing sent my way. Anyway, I hope you have a fantastic day. If it's the weekend, I hope you have a great weekend. And if it's the weekday, I hope you get to the weekend pretty quickly. I've been Montana After Midnight, or Devin. Have a good one.